hi everyone, and welcome to our session, and for reading through the full lengthy title of it to agree to come to our breakout session today. My name is Sarah Coughlin, and I'm a Senior Policy Associate at the Abdul Latif Jameel Poverty Action Lab, or JPAL. So I'm calling from Boston, USA today, and I'll hand it over to Leonie for a brief introduction.
Hi, everyone. My name is Leonie. I'm so glad to be here with you all. I work with Sarah at JPAL in our agriculture sector, and I'm also a senior policy associate. I'll hand it back to Sarah to get us started.
Great, thanks so much. So welcome again, everyone. Today in this breakout session, we are going to cover a review of rigorous evidence on information services, and particularly how to leverage extension to improve agricultural outcomes for farmers with a lens on how to include women farmers who tend to face additional sets of barriers in agriculture. And we'll stop at a few points throughout the presentation to answer any questions that come up in the chat. So please do feel free to pose your questions throughout. A quick roadmap of our session. We're going to start with an introduction of JPAL and our preferred methodology, followed by some background of the two initiatives that we run within JPAL's agriculture sector. Then we're going to lay out our constraints framework to guide how we talk about understanding the challenges that small-scale farmers face in increasing their productivity. And Leonie will cover more specifically our evidence on ICTs and how they can make extension services more effective, as well as the gender implications of ICT and extension more broadly.
And we'll wrap it up. Please screen share.
Oh, is it not? Oh, I'm so sorry. It must have dropped. Thanks for that catch.
Yep.
All right.
Looks good.
Okay, perfect. Let me just move everything around here. All right. Okay. So now that you can see our roadmap, I will dive right into our introduction to JPAL and randomized evaluations. Okay. And there's might be a bit of a lag, so I apologize. But at JPAL, we are a research center headquartered at MIT, and our mission is to reduce poverty by ensuring that policies and programs are informed by scientific evidence. And we do this through research, policy outreach, and training. I'll go through this quickly, but if you do have additional questions about JPAL, just feel free to ask us in chat or over the after the session. We work across a broad range of sectors in which research is concentrated around a specific topic. And in each of these sectors, we have a team of experts on staff who work alongside our network of affiliated researchers to share their research with wider audiences and to draw out key generalizable policy insights. And for a quick view, our affiliated researchers are based at leading universities around the world, many universities beyond what is shown here on the screen. But that's all to say that we do benefit from global knowledge generated by this very global network of affiliates who together have carried out over 1,000 randomized evaluations in countries around the world. In addition to this global knowledge, JPAL is also locally grounded. In addition to our offices at MIT, JPAL has a presence in LAC, Europe, Africa, South Asia, Southeast Asia, and the MENA region. So we benefit from seeing the big picture and look across this vast body of research to find cross-cutting themes and pull out policy lessons to inform future programs and policies alongside our partners. And we do this really by connecting the dots from research to action through our funding initiatives, supporting affiliates to carry out cutting-edge projects and providing research support on the ground. And then in each of our 11 sectors, staff adapt these research findings and distill them into advice and guidance to governments, NGOs, foundations, and anyone seeking to make their programs more effective. And we also teach practices and principles of randomized evaluations to researchers and research staff on one hand, and to partner organizations on the other through both in-person and virtual. And we think these three pillars are very closely interconnected and cyclical. So innovative research generates important policy insights, and trainings are designed to lead to new policy relevant research. So that's a bit about JPAL in general. I'm going to pause for a moment on our methodology before we dive into the actual evidence, because while there are many ways to evaluate the impact of a program, JPAL affiliates specialize in evaluating programs using randomized evaluations, or RCTs. And some folks in the room may be familiar with this methodology, but just to make sure that we're all on the same page, I'm going to walk through the intuition of it. And so say that we have, for example, we'll go outside of agriculture for a moment to say that we have a tutoring program that aims to improve student test scores. Of course, there's going to be variation in students' characteristics. Some students will be stronger students overall, denoted here by the darker orange color, and some will be weaker, the lighter orange color here. And so we want to understand whether this tutoring program has an impact on student outcomes, or whether there were perhaps some other factors at play, like socioeconomic status, motivation, anything else we can observe. And in an ideal world, we'd give this program to a group of individuals, see how their test scores changed, and then go back in time and measure the test scores they would have had if they hadn't received the program. This is also known as the counterfactual, but it's of course impossible to do this in real time. But RCTs help us to achieve a similar goal by randomly assigning individuals to either receive the program, the intervention group, or not to receive it, the comparison group. And because individuals are randomly assigned, we can be confident that they do not differ systematically at the beginning of the study. And so we know that before the program starts, the group that receives tutoring is not systematically better or worse off than the group that does not. And because the two groups are randomly assigned, there will likely be differences in characteristics in practice, but in those cases, we look at having a large enough sample size to ensure that the differences are negligible at the beginning of the study that is adequately powered. And then after randomization, we implement the program. So because our randomization is successful and the only systematic difference between the two groups is the presence of the program, we can now confidently attribute the differences in outcomes between the two groups to the intervention. And so randomization is really helpful in that it allows for a causal interpretation of the difference between the treatment and the control groups. And the evidence that we'll be sharing today all comes from randomized evaluations conducted by affiliates in our research network. So I think I hopefully have sold you on RCTs, but I do want to caveat here that they are, of course, not the only way to learn, and in practice require a lot of coordination between implementers and researchers, which make them not well suited for all contexts and all problems. They have become a widely used methodology beyond academia because this strong causality allows development partners to really understand the mechanisms behind why their programs are or are not working and be able to tweak them. But in some cases, they may not be right for a given program. RCTs require a very large sample size for randomization to occur. They're very expensive and take a long time, which draws in other feasibility constraints, like having to set the terms of the intervention at the beginning and then leaving it static for the duration of the study, which can be challenging in some program settings. But we focus on RCTs in agricultural economics to really understand the mechanisms behind why something is or isn't working, looking at behavioral and institutional mechanisms in programs and policies. Okay, I'll pause there if there are any questions, but I don't think that there are.
Okay. None in the chat.
Thanks, Courtney. All right, I'll briefly go into our initiatives here where some of the evidence that we're talking about comes from. So JPAL collaborates with the Center for Effective Global Action at UC Berkeley on the Agricultural Technology Adoption Initiative, which through RCTs aims to generate a rigorous evidence base to carefully identify whether particular approaches are successful in spurring agricultural transformation. And to date, we've funded over 85 projects, including 43 full randomized control trials in 18 countries across South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa. And I'm going to dive into a bit of our framework here to help motivate the studies that Leonie will be covering. So ATAI and our work in general is guided by a framework of working towards achieving agricultural transformation in rural economies, which, while this is a broad macro level approach, it has key micro level policy ingredients that RCTs can help to provide rigorous evidence on for each step in this theory of change, as well as the linkages between steps wherever there are significant evidence gaps. And so we think of it as a roadmap for broader agricultural transformation. But within this, we specifically look at constraints to technology adoption that prevent farmers from boosting their agricultural productivity or gaining market linkages. So we've generated more evidence on the first three buckets to the left here, and on the right is more of the macro level side. And we think as farmers of being facing quite a complex set of constraints in the real world. On the slide here are land and labor constraints. So, mechanization, for example, access to credit or savings to invest in profitable new technologies like fertilizer or improved seeds, as well as access to information, facing risks that may make investments seem too risky to make, and access to input and output markets. And, oh, I thought this slide was hidden, my bad. And while this portfolio of work from ATAI has generated a lot of research on each of these constraints, it's also shown that there is not one specific constraint which, if alleviated, would provide a change that can lead to agricultural transformation. And in part, this is attributable to the presence of multiple overlapping constraints, so that as soon as one key constraint, like access to credit, is loosened, another constraint binds. And so we have a more recent initiative that aims to generate a rigorous evidence base on digital tools that use a bundled approach to alleviate two or more constraints at one time. And this is the Digital Agricultural Innovations and Services Initiative. So I'll just mention this briefly, but as Leonie is going to cover, most of the evidence that we are going to be talking about today is generated from ATAI. And Leonie, I'll hand it over to you.
Great. Thanks so much, Sarah, for introducing ATAI and Daisy. So I'm going to dive into our evidence base, as Sarah has mentioned, on getting information to help farmers make decisions. So to begin with, why do farmers need information? While this question may be intuitive to many in the room, we wanted to start with some framing to guide our conversation. So learning about a new agricultural technology is a fundamentally hard learning problem. Many technologies work heterogeneously, where plot characteristics matter, and they may be very nonlinear with respect to the input choices. In any one year, farmers can only observe the performance of the technology under one weather realization, though they would care about the full distribution about how all of these pieces interact. So suppose farmers witness high yields on a test plot planted with a new technology. How would they know what their yield or profit would look like? They're going to need to know the plot characteristics, the input choices, and expected yields if the weather were to be different in the next season, for example. All of this to say that a farmer's decision to adopt a new technology requires several types of information. The farmer must know the technology exists, they must believe that the technology would benefit them, and they must know how to use it effectively. So how do farmers typically receive information? Agriculture extension is the most common vehicle to transmit this information in many low and middle income countries. Traditional extension relies on two main learning mechanisms to reach farmers. The first is direct training of farmers, and the second is social learning to diffuse knowledge to untrained farmers. The direct training often includes test plots to demonstrate new cultivation techniques, and it includes elements of group farmer trainings as well. Whereas social learning can involve training lead farmers who are then expected to share the knowledge that they've gained with peers throughout their community. And lastly, door-to-door in-person extension services, as well as information and communication technologies, or ICT, will seek to reach farmers directly as individuals. And while today we'll be focusing on ICT innovations, ICT methodologies are often incorporated into or complement government extension programs. And just briefly to review what these extension programs are normally a primary activity of national agriculture ministries, but they can mean many different things depending on the place. So take this framing here with a grain of salt. So government and NGO provided advice is generally designed to maximize yields rather than maximizing a farmer's profits. Whereas farmers, on the other hand, make decisions based on their profits rather than yields. So this disconnect may be due to overarching differences in priorities, because agriculture is a farmer's main source of income, and governments may be more interested in overall production to improve nutrition and food security of entire communities and the country more broadly. So we see this tension play out in practice. For example, in a study in Bali, seaweed farmers preferred to use the traditionally optimal amount of spacing of seaweed rather than adopting new recommendations from a local NGO run extension program, which would have reduced the farmers' profits, but actually increased the yields. In part because of this mismatch in priorities between farmers and agricultural ministries, traditional extension often has low impacts on getting farmers to actually adopt new technologies. However, there's potentially big costs to ignoring extension because it would be hard for farmers to learn about yield potential with new technologies. So to put an example here, Nerica rice, a high-yielding, drought and disease-resistant variety, was distributed in Sierra Leone alongside traditional extension. This led to an increase in yields of about 16% compared to villages where the seeds were only distributed without any extension services. So this suggests that without any training or information sharing, it can be hard for farmers to learn how to best gain from and use a new input. That said, a growing body of literature, including the studies here cited at the bottom of the slide, often suggest relatively low adoption or information diffusion stemming from a variety of these business as usual extension programs. These studies, therefore, demonstrate the need to tailor extension appropriately to farmers' contexts and their business needs. So how can the quality of extension be improved? And in what types of scenarios is information necessary for farmers to adopt productive technologies? Our larger body of evidence from randomized evaluations focuses on different mechanisms, including social learning that leverages social networks to get information to harder to reach farmers. Another mechanism is contracting field extension officers from within communities, or then building incentives into their contracts based on the levels of adoption among farmers. A third way is addressing some of the behavioral barriers that may hinder technology adoption, like procrastination, for example. And today we're going to do a deep dive into the last two noted here on the slide. The first being ICT to reach farmers and distribute information to a wide range of farmers at more frequent intervals. And the second is gender intentional design that can be achieved through extension programs that target both men and women in the household, or that bundle additional services to help alleviate gender-based barriers that women farmers face. So as most of you are probably familiar with, ICTs, such as phone calls and videos, have become an increasingly common and successful medium to convey technical information in a more digestible manner. And they have the added benefit of being designed and scaled cost effectively. So across a review of 10 studies testing the impact of ICT in transferring information, 8 of the programs found increases in farmers' knowledge, technology adoption, or both of these. It's important to note that access to smartphones, digital infrastructure, and digital literacy remain barriers to broader adoption of ICTs. But many small-scale farmers still use feature phones, so SMS is an effective way to reach farmers at scale. So to dive in a little bit deeper, 4 of the 10 programs also found improvements in farmers' yields, and we'll dive into some of these in the next few slides. It is important to note that the research also shows that lighter touch, more infrequent, or general information sharing through phone-based interventions may not be able to provide the level of training that's required to induce the adoption of a new or more complex technology. So for example, in India, text messages communicating the use and benefits of a flood-tolerant rice seed variety didn't improve farmer adoption or knowledge. And I see now Sarah's already on the next slide here. So I'm going to dive into a more detailed example. So in Kenya, researchers partnered with a leading sugar producer in East Africa, in Kenya's western province. In the contracting farmer scheme, the company worked with approximately 70,000 farmers. The company provided inputs like fertilizer on credit to farmers that were recouped at harvest through payment deductions. And the ability for the company to deliver information to farmers traditionally was limited because of the low ratio between field staff and farmers. And this was on the order of 1 to 1,000. Yet about 70% of farmers had access to a cell phone at the time the evaluation was conducted. So this created the potential for an SMS intervention to increase the flow of information between the company and the farmers. Beginning in 2011, researchers tested the impact of text message reminders on the agricultural productivity of the farmers contracted with the sugar company. They developed SMS messages that informed farmers about agricultural tasks to be performed around the time that the task needed to be completed. For example, reminders about weeding and parasite control. They also notified farmers about upcoming input deliveries, such as fertilizers. So sending the informational SMS messages to farmers increased plot yields in the first round by about 8%, which is equivalent to about 3.33 tons per hectare, in particular among the farmers who had no previous agronomy training in the previous year. The increased yields raised farmer revenues by about $54, and the intervention was also cost-effective at 0.02 per text message. However, it's important to note that these impacts were not sustained in the second agricultural season. This is in part due to differences in weather conditions, which demonstrates how the additional constraint of weather-based risk can hinder the success of alleviating just one constraint that farmers face. But overall, researchers suggest that the phone-based interventions may be particularly effective when they're run by organizations with an economic incentive to both research and invest in ICT solutions, like was the case with the sugar company. And also when they're able to achieve economies of scale in producing the information. So that's one example of an SMS message campaign. I'm now going to turn over to videos, which are another form of ICT that can support information dissemination when incorporated into traditional extension services. So videos can also help deliver technical content in a more digestible manner, and particularly in contexts where there's low financial literacy. I'm going to go through a study conducted in Ethiopia, where local farmers were featured in videos. And this may encourage farmers to adopt the promoted technologies, in part because of this role model effect of seeing members in your own community adopt a particular practice or technology. So I'll dive now into this study in more detail that was conducted in partnership with Digital Green, a global development organization that creates digital solutions for small-scale farmers. So in this study, Ethiopia's Ministry of Agriculture with Digital Green developed customized videos for development agents or extension workers to feature during regular extension services. They also specifically included farmers' spouses in the extension sessions in Ethiopia. And past research had found of Ethiopia's extension system that there's a relatively weak relationship between technical support provided by the extension workers and a farmer's productivity growth. So researchers decided to conduct a randomized evaluation to measure whether incorporating videos into the traditional extension services could be a strategy to increase engagement during the sessions and reduce the burden on overworked extension agents. They also tested whether adding the video instruction would increase farmers' uptake of 3 agricultural technologies that were being promoted: row planting, precise seeding rate, and urea and topside dressing. So in the first year of the study, farmers' uptake of the 3 recommended technologies increased by 6 percentage points. So it was from a base of 64%. So this was about a 10% increase. And in the second year, the uptake rates remained consistent. There was no additional increase in technology uptake with the involvement of spouses, interestingly. The intervention did, however, increase access to extension services and improve knowledge of the recommended technologies among women. Farmers in the group that received the video intervention also scored 1.35 percentage points higher on a knowledge test about the technologies than those in the group that did not receive the video addition to their extension session. It's important to note that despite the higher uptake of the recommended technologies, agricultural yields did not increase for either the video-mediated approach or the group that also targeted spouses. This is potentially due to measurement errors from farmers' self-reported data on yields, and could also be due to issues with the technologies themselves. But taken together, these results suggest that video instruction is an effective ICT tool to increase the uptake of agricultural technologies. And rather than replacing conventional extension services, video instruction can complement existing services through targeted advice to small-scale farmers. Also from this study here, the implementing partners, the Ministry of Agriculture and Digital Green, used the evidence to develop a new program called Digital Agriculture Advisory Services, which facilitated the scale-up of this video-mediated approach. So I'm going to hand off back to Sarah now to discuss more the gender implications of this study and gender intentional design more generally. But before I do, I just wanted to pause briefly and Courtney, ask you if we have any questions in the chat that maybe we can address before I pass on to Sarah.
We do. So here's a question from Victoria. How can I, as an extension agent, effectively assist local farmers in adopting modern agricultural technology? And what strategies can be employed to address the challenges of working with farmers who are resistant to change? Do you want me to ask the first one first and then ask the second one later, or did you get them both?
No, that's okay. I think we can kind of walk through both of them.
Perfect.
So these are really great questions and really challenging. So I think as I've walked through a little bit, some of the strategies are both through using SMS messages as well as incorporating videos. Videos, of course, take more time to produce, maybe more costly, but the SMS messages are really a great way to send more kind of quick reminders in a cost-effective way. Sarah, is there anything you want to add on this?
Yeah, I'll just say thanks so much for that question, and we hope that the evidence that Leonie walked through shed some light on that issue. But to take a bit of a step back, we're focusing today only on ICT information, but there are many other strategies and mechanisms that we have generated evidence on. So what feels very relevant to the question of farmers are not willing to adopt, they're reluctant to change in communities that may be more reluctant to do so, looking at the evidence on behavioral mechanisms and social learning could be very relevant. So there was a bit of this in the studies that Leonie highlighted, but additionally, we can share evidence on how to utilize peer farmers and lead farmers to gain a trusted voice within the community, to be a first adopter of a technology and then disseminate that information through their peer networks. And we have evidence on strategies on what has and hasn't worked so well on how to do this. I may be reading a bit too much into your question, but I think also an interesting study that's included in this review of the literature is on providing a very simple technology to overcome trust. There's reputational barriers at risk when farmers share information amongst each other. If it's something that's very new and they're just learning about it, then there could be cases that farmers don't want to be the one to disseminate that information for fear that results won't pay off, that they won't be describing the technology perfectly accurately, and their reputation in a community may suffer. So leveraging simple tools, in one example, a blue spoon that was used to measure accurate amounts of fertilizer was cheap and very effective in promoting the adoption of a new technology, because farmers could say, hey, there's this simple blue tool, it's worked for me, it might work for you, and saw in that community that farmers were more willing to adopt after that. So that would be the response I have. Anything else to add to my tangent there, Leonie, before we move on?
No, I think that's great. And perhaps we can share both of those resources that you mentioned at the end, both our policy that lays out kind of the different buckets of strategies to better reach farmers, and also maybe that blue spoon study that you had referred to.
Yes, and we'll drop in our contact email at the end of the presentation for any further questions on this. Oh, and I saw your response, Victoria. Yes, thanks so much. Great. Okay, I am going to dive into now. We focused broadly on ICTs, thanks to Leonie's overview. And in that, just going back to that specific study in Ethiopia, saw that spouses in that case were intentionally included in video-mediated extension programs. However, this often isn't the case because agricultural extension services can generally be targeted towards the head of the farm household, and in many cases, that's the male member of the household. And another barrier to ensuring the inclusivity of women in information sharing is that extension agents, although not always, they typically are men and may so be more likely to engage with men than with women. And on the flip side, female members of agricultural households may be less comfortable engaging with male agents due to prevailing social norms. And this is problematic because when agricultural information mainly reaches men, it can often reinforce male dominance in agricultural decision-making. And such biases affect women's ability to make informed decisions and limit their intra-household bargaining power. Unfortunately, to date, fewer studies have intentionally targeted both men and women of farming households in their interventions and programs. But that is a prominent focus of our current research agenda under the DAISY initiative that I mentioned earlier. And in this review of the literature, 2 studies increased women's engagement with advisory services and knowledge of new technologies. Briefly, I'll go into one example in Uganda, in which maize farming households were shown a video about improved maize management practices. And in this case, the video was shown to either the male member of the household, to the female member of the household, or to both of them together as a couple. And involving women as recipients of information improved their knowledge and adoption of the recommended practice by 13 percentage points relative to when only male members of the household received information, which was a huge percentage change. Importantly, women who received information also experienced an increase in their agricultural decision-making power, although this result in this study was mainly driven by providing only the female member of the household with information rather than providing the information jointly. And so targeting women within programs is one strategy, but to increase sort of the availability of information and bring them into extension services. But we also want to take a step back and note that women face multidimensional constraints that are gender specific, such as limited decision-making power within the household, differential access to financial services. They may not have a bank account or access to formal banking. And it's imperative to holistically address these constraints in order to address their lower agricultural productivity outcomes. And so one method to do this, in addition to the targeting of women within extension services, is to bundle extension services with other offerings, such as gender sensitization training, or to target sort of gender-specific financial services that are accessible to women. One example of this is in Bangladesh, in which agricultural training focused on the cultivation of high-value crops was bundled with nutrition information and a gender sensitization training. And this was delivered to both male and female members of farming households. Receiving all three of these separate interventions together increased the number of women who felt empowered by 52%, which was higher than the impact of any of the individual interventions. And from these studies, I think our policy takeaway is that it's important to intentionally include and target women through extension programs. Innovative approaches like video-based learning and bundling can be effective in empowering women to become agricultural decision makers. In future research, again, as I mentioned, and Daisy, we're very focused on this, can focus on how the content and delivery mechanism of agricultural extension services can be made more relevant to the unique constraints that women farmers face, again, beyond just the immediate agricultural constraints they face, but the multidimensional gender-based barriers. Okay. And I'm just going to, we've covered many studies today. I'm just going to wrap up by taking a step back. So in summary, in extension services, we've looked within extension to understand how service delivery, quality, and targeting of men and women farmers can be improved to make information access more effective and inclusive for all small-scale farmers. But again, taking a step back, I want to look at the strengths and limitations of alleviating the information constraint on its own, just altogether. Because unfortunately, as the top line heading suggests, general extension is often ineffective, but improved extension is critical when there are new technologies that are not readily understood by farmers or that are complicated by heterogeneity, so it's difficult to translate them from one context to another. And on the slide are just some of the ways in which we've sort of generated research on how extension can be improved, from leveraging social networks, using incentives, and addressing behavioral barriers like that trust and reputational constraint that I talked about in the blue spoons example. Today, we focused on technology, so ICT interventions and gender intentional design. However, information just provided on its own is often not enough to increase farmers' profits, which is the long-run outcome that we care about. We have more measurements of productivity and yields, but less so on looking at long-term transformation of profits. And so we really think that to improve this, extension should be bundled with other offerings to help alleviate more constraints that small-scale farmers face. and in this way recommend that policymakers leverage extension as a supporting intervention that can be bundled with other services that provide technology adoption and encourage demand for extension. I have a few more slides to wrap up, but I'm just going to take a moment to look at the chat now. And if anyone has any questions now on the content that we've provided, I would welcome you to throw more of those into the chat in the Q&A.
Do you see the one from Nada?
I don't actually. Oh, yes, I do. I just hadn't scrolled down. So Nada is asking that, thanks, Courtney. Oftentimes, we require feedback from the farmer throughout the season to adjust the recommendation. For example, when a certain disease appears in a crop. Studies on how to have a two-way communication channel with farmers during the season efficiently. That's a great question. Thanks, Nada, and is definitely relevant across contexts and growing seasons. I'd encourage Leonie, if you have any specific studies top of mind, what I'm thinking of is more innovations with sort of chatbots and AI, in which even just simply over WhatsApp, there are newer innovations for farmers to like take a picture of their crop and show what is appearing in real time. I think these are very new innovations, and we don't yet have a body of rigorous evidence on that. But we do have some examples of programs that are using WhatsApp and interactive chatbots for farmers to be able to have a bit of a back and forth within the season itself. Leonie, do you have anything top of mind?
I'll jump in quickly. This is a really interesting point and something that we do have some evidence on. So there's a study in Rwanda that's coming to mind that provides a feedback channel for farmers to provide feedback on the trainings. And what this study found is that farmers that were able to kind of interact more, providing feedback to the trainers, improved trust and engagement with the extension services. And we're actually, the farmers that were not offered this were half as likely to leave the program the following year than farmers who were able to interact more and provide feedback. So this is really just showing how having this two-way streak is an important way to kind of keep the communication going. I can pull this study and send it around at the end as well. But this kind of falls within the bucket of evidence that we have on also incentivizing trainers and kind of holding trainers accountable to improve agricultural outcomes. So this is a really great point, and I can definitely share this study.
There's another question that popped up. Please provide a couple of existing examples of an effective bundled service to combine with extension or knowledge sharing.
Yes, that's great. Thanks so much for your question, Laura. First, I'll answer it more broadly because I think the way that we talk about bundling is can be quite narrow. But for example, if we're talking about uptake of a new say there's a new improved seed variety that is flood or drought tolerant and may do very well, but is different than the traditional variety that's used in the community, and take-up rates of it are very low. Since it's a new technology and there might be, specific recommendations on when to plant it, how to plant it, what specific combinations of inputs are needed, this would be a great example of when extension services are needed to boost farmers' uptake, but potentially we commonly see with new technologies that they may incur a higher upfront investment, even though with this improved seed variety, you'd anticipate a higher return at the end. And so potentially bundling information about the new seed variety with credit or loan access to farmers for them to understand the benefits that they are likely to receive at the end of the season, with a way to overcome liquidity or cash constraints that they're also facing at the beginning of the season, that even if they know about the technology and are interested in taking it up, may prevent them from doing so, is an effective way to sort of get farmers to start to take up a new technology. And so that's sort of one common example, is information and credit constraint together.
I'm wondering, Sarah and Leonie, I hate to put you on the spot, but if you're open to maybe putting your contact information in the chat, sounds like some people definitely want to chat post-event, and I don't know how soon I can turn an attendance report around for you, so that might be a better solution.
That's
And
so fair. Yes,
Laura responded with, yes,
I
sounds good. The challenge is sourcing the funding for the farmers.
I would agree with that, Laura. Sorry, you definitely preempted that. Totally understand. The broad challenge there, I don't have the answer to at the moment. Thanks for that point, Courtney. We're glad to type our emails in the chat. I have just a quick conclusion slide here for how to chat with us more generally and partner, whether your questions are on the additional information that we have to share, or if you're interested in evaluating your own program or policy. And then the last slide has our contact information as well. But yeah, to wrap up, we engage and collaborate with partners in a myriad of ways because we engage with different types of partners. So some folks on the call might be researchers themselves, others are extension agents, which is wonderful, or operators of other policies and programs. And so that's great to hear, Laura, thanks. So we really aim to bring together organizations, partners, and leading academic researchers to generate policy relevant research. We want to combine academic research or academic interest with the realities on the ground and what is relevant to folks, bringing it back to the beginning of the session when I talked about sort of the cyclical nature. So we both matchmake organizations and researchers to generate new research projects, as well as try to share the learnings from these studies to audience such as these or through tailored trainings. And all of the studies that Leonie and I talked about today are synthesized in a report that we produced, and it covers many other buckets of evidence within just information. We also talked a lot about the other constraints that farmers face that we don't have an answer for today, such as risk and quality upgrading, access to credit, and have reports on those as well that we, again, are happy to share. So on the side here is just a few of the ways in which we, again, engage and collaborate with partners. If any of these spark your interest, I do encourage you to reach out. This slide, as promised, has our overall email that you can reach any staff at, and I'll drop my email and Leonie will as well in the chats. Okay. And then I'm just taking a look at whether any other questions have popped up in the meantime.
And sorry, let me read this one. I feel like it hasn't been asked, but I want to make sure. So Katrin says, thank you very much for the presentation. Can you say something about the frequency of the intervention / exposure to information to support long-term adoption? Not sure if that's already been answered, but wanted to make sure it was covered.
Great, thanks for this question. I'll start off, and then again, Leonie, if you'd like to jump in. I think many of our studies look at results over a few agricultural seasons. So if we're talking about long-term adoption over 10 or more years, I don't necessarily have any specific results to point to, but when we've, the studies here would be over multiple agricultural seasons. And I think the frequency of the interventions depends on the type of information. So we cover both more intensive in-person trainings that are perhaps less cost effective to do more often, but we found again through ICTs that a more cheap and cost effective way to have more frequent communication is through SMS messages. And in addition to frequency of exposure to information, we find that the timing of it really matters. There are key points in the season, of course, when farmers are making decisions. And so timing the information to before that point when they're able to decide whether to engage in that practice or have time to be able to buy the required input is also key, as was mentioned from the study in, I'm blanking now on whether it's Sierra Leone or Kenya that Leonie talked about. Anything to add there, Leonie?
No, I think you've hit the main points that these studies are time intensive, and we like to look across multiple agricultural seasons and And a lot of the studies are ongoing and will eventually try to capture the more long-term effects. But kind of at this stage, especially with the newer projects in our portfolio, we're not quite at the stage of measuring the long-term adoption.
Thanks so much for that question. Appreciate it.
I've also dropped in the chat here the policy insight we've been referring to throughout the presentation that kind of summarizes the key takeaways on improving information dissemination and extension services for small-scale farmers. And you can see in this resource, this individual studies are cited throughout, so you can click on those for a more deep dive on studies that were conducted throughout the portfolio.
Perfect. Thanks so much, Leonie. And thank you everyone for your really strong questions and engagement throughout the session. We really appreciate it. Again, you have our contact information, so we very much would love to continue connecting and keeping the conversation open.